Tired, sleepy.
Tired?
Yeah.
So today we will talk about antimicrobial use. So objectives, we'll talk first about how we measure resistance, and so you should be able to recognize the methods used to measure antibiotic resistance. We'll talk about some factors that are driving the current state of affairs when it comes to encouraging resistance. We'll also talk a little bit about techniques that can be used to use antibiotics appropriately and optimally. And then finally, we'll talk about some PK/PD principles and how we use PK/PD principles to dose certain antibiotic classes and take advantage of PK/PD principles to get better therapy, basically. So I think I may have shown you this slide before. This is just an example of some of the many resistant pathogens that we currently are seeing right now. So on the top left there you have MRSA, certainly a very common thing now, a community-associated infection as well, which it never really was. You see in the middle there, E. coli resistance. You also see TB. We have TB now that is resistant to every single drug that we have. Basically, it's not common, fortunately, but fairly bad thing, obviously. Neisseria gonorrhea there you have in the middle. Neisseria gonorrhea, we essentially have one drug right now that is reliable against that agent. We used to be able to use quinolones. We used to be able to use, even way back in the 40s and 50s, penicillins. And gradually, over the years, the CDC has just been lopping drugs off the list of drugs that can be used to treat gonorrhea. So, major problem right now. Then on the bottom right there, you have so-called NDM1 producing Klebsiella pneumoniae, which was so named. So NDM1 stands for New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase, named that way because these isolates were first identified in patients who were in New Delhi, India. So these are just some of the examples of the many resistant pathogens that we are seeing right now. And then what this slide shows really is the timeline between antimicrobial development and antimicrobial resistance. So on the bottom you have, or sorry, on the top you have the year in which different antibiotics were first deployed, and then you have the year that resistance was first observed to that agent. A couple of things to note. One would be that, as you can see, it doesn't take very long in many cases to have resistance develop after we have an agent that's been introduced. And in fact, sometimes resistance happens even before a drug is commercially available because it just already exists out in the environment. That's one thing to notice about this slide. Another thing to notice about this slide is, as you can see, over time, you see fewer and fewer antibiotics that are coming out. And so we've talked about that on a few occasions, I guess, but really we're in this state of affairs currently right now where there's not very many drugs, not very many drugs that are coming out. Most big pharma companies are completely out of the anti-infective game, so to speak. I think I've asked you this question before, but any ideas on the major reason for that? There are several reasons, but the major reason? So money, right? So antibiotics basically tend to be, when all is said and done, with all of the years and billions of dollars to produce and get a drug on the market, antibiotics tend to lose money compared to other drugs. So if you get pneumonia, you're going to receive a drug for 7 days, maybe 10 days, whereas if you receive, or if you get hypertension, you're going to be potentially on an ACE inhibitor for your entire life, basically. So the profit margins are just really poor. So really, for that reason, most of the drug development right now is with infectious diseases that are chronic diseases. So HIV would be one example. We have lots of new HIV meds coming out because you're going to be on therapy for life. Another example would be hepatitis, so you're going to have really long-term chronic therapy. So unfortunately, when it comes to antibiotics, those are all going to be really, for the most part, short-term use, and so not very profitable, unfortunately, for companies. And then another thing about antibiotics, so it said that antimicrobials are unique compared to all other classes of drugs. So the only class of drugs that we know reliably, the more you use them over time, they're eventually going to lose efficacy. You're going to have more and more resistance develop, and eventually your drug will be way down the road, perhaps, or maybe in the shorter term, will be an unusable drug, essentially. They're the only, so related to that, they're the only class of drugs that will lose efficacy over time, also the more that they're used. So the more you use a drug, the more likelihood that you see resistance to it. They're also the only class of drugs where we try to spare the use of them. And related to that too, they're the only class of drugs in which newer drugs are actively discouraged from being used. And so if you had a brand new antihypertensive that had a lot of good advantages to it, we would embrace that drug. Whereas from the standpoint of a drug company, you sort of can't blame them for not developing antibiotics, because if they develop some really nice, new, unique antibiotic, not a me-too drug, but something that really offers an advantage, maybe as a different mechanism of action, that drug gets released, you're going to have ID pharmacists and ID physicians who are going to be saying, you can't use that drug, we have to keep it in our back pockets for the future, and so you're not making any money whatsoever, basically. So that's a big problem, too, when it comes to actively avoiding the use of newer drugs. Just briefly about the consequences of resistance. Certainly, maybe we wouldn't care so much about resistance if it didn't have major outcomes, but it does, unfortunately. So this is data from the IDSA showing that each year, about 2 million patients develop hospital-acquired infections. The majority of those infections being hospital-acquired are caused by infections or caused by organisms that are antimicrobial resistant, and about 99,000 of those patients die. Also, as you see, each year in the United States, MRSA kills more Americans combined than emphysema, HIV and AIDS, Parkinson's disease, and homicide combined. And that's just MRSA. And so huge problems when it comes to morbidity and mortality and bad outcomes. Also costs, so the costs of a patient who maybe you could treat on an outpatient basis, but because their infection is caused by a resistant pathogen, you can't do so, you have to admit them to the hospital. Being in a hospital is certainly very expensive, and so that adds to costs. Also, if you get into the hospital and you still have that resistant pathogen, you may end up in the ICU, which is even more expensive. There's also the costs of constantly changing therapies and the drug costs of using drugs that don't work and having to constantly switch. So as you see, a lot of days of hospitalization each year are caused strictly by resistant pathogens that we can't treat effectively. And then finally, resistance certainly limits our antibiotic options. So again, one example being Neisseria gonorrhoeae, for which we currently right now have exactly one drug that really is reliable, and resistance to that drug has been reported. So not a good state of affairs. So how do we measure and monitor resistance? So we talked a little bit about this. So the MIC basically. So how do we measure susceptibility? And again, people are sensitive, plugs are susceptible basically. So what we're measuring basically is the ability of an organism to grow in the presence of antimicrobial concentrations in vitro, so in the lab. And we're going to use that to predict our in vivo clinical success and to measure and or detect the presence of resistance basically. There are both qualitative and quantitative methods that exist, and there's an organization, again, CLSI, that in the US is basically the organization that tells us the methodologies and how to interpret MICs. And so all microbiology labs in the US adhere basically to CLSI guidelines when they're doing their MIC testing. So here's just an example. So you have basically a range of concentrations in test tubes. On the left, you have a control just to make sure that the organism is viable. And then each one of these test tubes has a certain concentration. As I think I've said, again, in most ways that we do MIC testing, there's this standard set of concentrations. So you go, for instance, from 1 to 2 to 4. There's no 3 or 3.5. And so we have this very sort of standardized set of concentrations. So you add your organism, you have 10 to the 5 colonies per ml, which is a fairly standard inoculum size to add. And then you add the organism to the tubes, and you basically incubate overnight. Then you have this scenario where your control tube, you have growth, and then you have growth in 0.125 mics per ml, 0.25, etc. And so the MIC basically is the lowest concentration that inhibits visible growth of your organism. So that would be, in this scenario, 2 micrograms per ml. So we said that this is an E. coli isolate in this example, and that we've tested ciprofloxacin. So basically you would say that Cipro's MIC for this particular E. coli isolate is 2 micrograms per ml or milligrams per liter. So then again, the question becomes, if you have a patient with this isolate, and I asked you, based strictly on that result of MIC of 2, can you treat this patient with Cipro? Yes, no, maybe. Need more information. Anyone want to say yes? So I have 1 or 2 yeses, maybe. Anyone want to say no? Need more information? Right, so we need more information. So you really, in just knowing only the MIC, you can't really make a definitive decision about whether you can use that drug or not. So what you need to know before you can make that decision is you need to know what the so-called breakpoints are. And so this is a a table from the CLSI documents that describe how to do MICs. And so basically, breakpoints are the MICs by which you would categorize an isolate as being either susceptible, intermediately resistant, or resistant. And so this is interpreted standards for Enterobacteriaceae. The way the CLSI documents are broken up is that you have organism-specific sections. Some of those sections are specific for an individual organism. So for instance, there's a Neisseria gonorrhoeae section of the CLSI documents. This happens to be a case where we have a whole section for a family of organisms, so all of the Enterobacteriaceae. And so then you have further, you have it broken down by drugs. And so this is the section on the quinolones for Enterobacteriaceae. There are also sections for cephalosporins, for penicillins, etc. And so as you see there, you have your different antimicrobial agents. You have the MIC that corresponds to an S, an I, or an R. So S meaning susceptible, I meaning intermediately resistant, and R being resistant. And so if someone said to you, what is the breakpoint for Cipro against E. coli? You have breakpoints for susceptibility or for resistance. What they're usually asking you is, what is the breakpoint for susceptibility? And so in this example, you see that the Cipro MIC that corresponds to a finding of S, and my pointer's not working, sorry, you see there is 1. So anything less than or equal to 1 as your MIC, you would conclude that the isolate is susceptible to ciprofloxacin. Does that make sense? If your MIC for Cipro was 4 or greater, you would conclude that the isolate is resistant to ciprofloxacin. And then I is sort of in the middle there. So as far as what these mean clinically, so susceptible basically implies that the isolate is going to be inhibited by the usually achievable concentrations of that antimicrobial when you give the recommended dose and it's used at an appropriate site of infection. So I think one important thing is that S is no guarantee, certainly, and especially if you underdose someone, if you don't account for the fact that someone is larger than average maybe, then you give a suboptimal dose, then you're kind of tipping the scales away from success. Also, if you use a drug that doesn't get very good concentrations at the site of infection, you're also perhaps not going to have success. So an S assumes that you know what you're doing when it comes to dosing and using the right drug. But even if you do those things, it still is not a guarantee, but it means that there's a likelihood of clinical success. I'll go down to resistant next. So resistant basically means or implies that the isolate is not going to be inhibited by usual concentrations of the drug. So basically it means that if you were to use that drug in this patient, you're going to have more than likely clinical failure. You might get lucky and have success, but the odds are very slim. And then finally, intermediate in the middle there is basically really that another word for the intermediate category is dose dependent or concentration dependent. And so that would imply that you can really only have a likelihood of success if you are using a drug where you can either give a larger than normal dose and increase your concentrations, or you're treating an infection where that particular drug gets very good concentrations at the site of infection. So unfortunately with antibiotics, we really can't push our doses very much because of toxicity. So you can't suddenly give someone 10 times the dose of piperacillin and think you're going to be okay if you have an intermediately resistant isolate. So we really can't do that. But as we'll see, there are scenarios where a drug might get extremely good concentrations, and then maybe you could still treat an isolate that had that intermediately resistant finding. So one example being if you had a UTI and an E. coli isolate that was intermediately resistant to Bactrim. Bactrim gets such huge concentrations in the urine that you probably could still have good clinical outcomes if you treated that patient with Bactrim. The same would be true for quinolones as well, with one exception, which is quinolone that doesn't get good urine concentrations. Not levo, so moxiflox is the case. So any questions about what these mean? How are you doing on getting your bugs and drugs down pat? You have it all down already?
Nope.
You're all ready for next week?
Nope. This weekend.
So those are MICs. Another thing with MICs that you'll see is what's called the MIC 50 and the MIC 90. These are essentially ways that we kind of characterize an overall population of isolates. And so in this example, we're going to test MICs for 50 isolates of E. coli, and we're going to test ciprofloxacin MICs for all of those isolates. And so you have a heterogeneous population of isolates where their MICs are not all the same. And so you see that the first 20 isolates that you test have an MIC of 0.125. then you have 30 isolates that have an MIC of 0.25. So we're testing 100 isolates. We've now reached, between these two categories, 50 isolates. So we've reached the concentration that inhibits 50% of the isolates that we're testing. So that would be your MIC 50. Then you keep going, and finally, when you have 20 more isolates that have an MIC of 0.5, you have 10 isolates that have an MIC of 1, and then you have 10 more isolates with an MIC of 2. You've now reached a total of 90 isolates, so the concentration that would inhibit 90% of the isolates that you're testing would be 2 micrograms per ml, basically. So we use these as kind of overall population figures to give an overall representation of resistance in a population. So for instance, in a hospital, you might say, well, what is the MIC 90 for us for ciprofloxacin against E. coli? And if you knew the answer to that, it would give you kind of an overall sense of the amount of resistance in that hospital, for instance. So the next few slides are just some examples of what are called surveillance studies, and so studies where we systematically are measuring MICs and trying to track resistance over time. This would be one example. So looking at staphylococci in Brazilian hospitals from 2005 to 2008. So on the top there you have MSSA. And so for instance, with the erythromycin, the MIC 50 was less than or equal to 0.25, the MIC 90 was greater than 2. Then using breakpoint values, those MICs are translated into the percent of isolates that were susceptible and resistant to erythromycin over that period of time, basically. So one way that you could use this data would be if you were now treating a patient in Brazil who had an MSA infection, you might conclude from this data that perhaps erythromycin maybe is not your best option, and maybe something like linezolid is a better option, again, with taking into account other things like drug-drug interactions, et cetera. But this kind of gives you an overall sense of what is the level of resistance to these different pathogens over time, basically. This is another example, so looking at Salmonella typhimurium, this is data from the CDC. So just showing over time, over a number of years, the percent of isolates resistant to it. In this example, at least ampicillin, chlorphenicol, streptomycin, sulfonamides, and tetracyclines. And so again, just a way to track over time from a surveillance point of view and from an epidemiologic point of view, what is happening when it comes to resistance with this organism. Here's another example looking at surveillance on a geographic basis, and so certainly resistance can vary when it comes to geography, and so we in Portland, Maine are relatively spared from antibiotic resistance. If you go down to New York City, on the other hand, just with the more crowded populations, et cetera, you're going to have lots more resistance, and there have been outbreaks of some seriously resistant pathogens in New York City, whereas here in Maine, we actually have very little when it comes to resistance. But this is an example of a geographic distribution, and so different countries in Europe and sort of the different ranges of resistance values in those different countries. And so that would be important as far as if you're in this case, the UK, you have very little resistance in Streptococcus pneumoniae, whereas if you're in France, for instance, you have pretty high levels of resistance. So a way to kind of track on a geographic level, essentially. And then next would be an antibiogram, so we're kind of getting a little bit more down to the patient-specific level, although we're not there yet. And so this would be an example of an antibiogram. Hospitals will all, or they all should be publishing antibiograms. They often do so annually, and so when you get on your APPEs in a couple of years, you'll find that physicians will all have, or they should have, a copy of their hospital antibiogram in their pocket so they can kind of pull it out and get an overall good sense of resistance patterns in that hospital. And so this is an example of a typical antibiogram, and so this is for just in this example gram-positive cocci. You have you have the isolate on the left, and you have the number of isolates that were tested. So this might be in a year again, because these are often published on an annual basis. Then you have all of your different drugs, and you have the percent of isolates in that year that were susceptible. So what this does again is it gives you an overall sense of in your hospital, what is the resistance rates for these different drugs. And the way that you would use this clinically would be similar to a couple of slides ago. If this is the Maine Medical Center antibiogram, and you're a physician working in Maine Medical Center, and you have a new patient who has, let's say, a Streptococcus pneumoniae infection, so we'll go down the very bottom of the list here, and you're trying to choose therapy, you don't know your MICs yet, so you're in that empiric phase of therapy. You would use this to decide that maybe penicillin is not my best option because only about half of the isolates last year were susceptible. whereas ceftriaxone, almost all the isolates were susceptible, so that would be a better choice. So we use this really when you're doing that empiric phase of therapy. And then finally, we have the patient-specific level of reporting. So certainly on exams, to give you fair warning, you'll be asked to interpret some of these reports. And so here we have a male patient, John Doe. We see that this is a urine culture isolate collected at a certain date and time. And here's the different MIC values for this E. coli isolate. So you see your antimicrobial, you then see the MIC, and then you see, based on the breakpoints from CLSI, what is the conclusion as far as the so-called interpretive category. So is it an R or an I, or is it an S? So in this example, if I were to ask you to choose a therapy in John Doe based strictly on this table of MICs, any ideas what you might want to choose? So meropenem would be one option. Yep. So really, when you're looking at these isolates or these types of tables, look for S's basically. So you're looking for things or drugs to which the isolate is susceptible. So in this case, really, your only options pretty much are meropenem, fosfomycin, and nitrofurantoin to treat this isolate, because those are the only drugs that are reported as the isolate being susceptible to, basically.
Well, amikacin.
Yes, sorry, amikacin. Thank you. So amikacin as well. So anything with an S is fair game, basically. You wouldn't want to choose, so if this were an exam question and you chose ampicillin, you would not get the question correct, of course, because the isolate is resistant to ampicillin. The I's are a little bit trickier, and so I think the best course of, or the best plan of action would be consider I's as R's, essentially. And so you really should not choose an I unless perhaps you had no S's, and then you might, especially in a UTI, for instance, you might be able to get away again with using, say, Bactrian or Quinolone. But generally speaking, I's really should be R's in your mind. And so again, with this type of report, you would just look for your S's, and those would all be drugs that the agent is susceptible to. Does that make sense? This is not really relevant to today's lecture, but I think you're probably getting the sense that I like, or I want you to know the pharmacology of MRSA, basically, or the mechanism of MRSA. So, which of the following agents could be used to treat an MRSA infection? There's only one choice that's correct. D, right. So, again, MRSA does not become MRSA through beta-lactamase production, and so that's why A would not be correct. Also does not do so by active efflux. Also does not do so because it's acetylation. What would acetylation be a mechanism of resistance to? Anyone remember? Class of drugs where the most important mechanism is a variety of different chemical modifications, so acetylation, phosphorylation, adenylation. Also a class of drugs where you have to be careful in patients who have renal dysfunction. Also a class of drugs that can make you go deaf. So aminoglycosides, right? So C would apply to aminoglycosides. So again, subterranean is the only one because MRSA becomes MRSA through producing altered penicillin binding proteins, and subterranean has activity against PBP2A. So just a reminder of some pharmacology, I guess. So what promotes resistance then, as far as factors that are kind of, again, spurring on this current epidemic of resistance? And so some bacterial characteristics certainly, and so there are certain bacteria, anthrax and C. diff are two notable examples that can have spore forms of those bacteria. Spore forms are extremely hard to get rid of, and so if you, for instance, disinfect a hospital room that has had a C. diff infection in that room, and you just use alcohol, you're basically doing nothing. And so to get rid of C. diff, for instance, you have to use bleach. So certainly bacteria that can have those spore forms are harder to get rid of, and so they then can become resistant as well. A biofilm basically is a layer of slime, so to speak, that forms on foreign bodies. And so, for instance, if you have an IV catheter in your arm, you have it in there for days or weeks, you can have this layer of slime basically that builds on the surface of that IV catheter. there's a picture there of a biofilm, and then bacteria can go into that biofilm, and there's really two things that happen. One is that they're sort of spared from the effect of antibiotics because they're hiding out in this layer of slime. The other thing is that if there are other bacteria in there, they can swap their DNA back and forth and basically promote resistance as well. So that's a big factor, certainly. And then microbes do have the ability in a number of ways to transfer resistance back and forth to each other. So an example would be plasmid transfer. So if you think, for example, about the way that enterococci got together with staphylococci, they swapped DNA and you had the development of resistance to vancomycin in staphylococci. This is a picture from the Oregonian, which is the major newspaper of the other Portland, announcing the opening of a new clinic for naturopaths. And so the question is, what is wrong with this picture?
Clogged up or messed up or...
What should be happening in this picture that is not happening in this picture?
Gloves.
Right, gloves. So this person is examining this person not wearing gloves. And so just simply doing something as simple as wearing gloves can do a lot towards preventing infections and also preventing the spread of resistance as well.
She's also got like jewelry and a watch on.
Right, she has a watch, she has jewelry. We'll talk about that in a second. That's also another thing that can also spread resistance as well, you're right. So related to that would be hygiene. And so it's been shown time and time again that hand washing is probably the most effective way of preventing resistance and also preventing infection rather, and also preventing resistance. There are some really dismal studies where we're looking at, even amongst physicians, nurses, and pharmacists, how well do they comply with hand washing? Pretty poorly, actually. It's kind of embarrassing when you read some of the studies. And so nowadays in hospitals, often the hospitals will have a dedicated person who basically walks around and points to you and says, hey, you just walked out of that room and you didn't wash your hands. And so kind of like the hand washing police, basically. So a big problem, and it's always been a problem, is despite us knowing that hand washing can do a lot to prevent infection, we still, on the whole, are not very good at doing so. When it comes to hand sanitizers, so hand sanitizers, everyone has one nowadays. Any ideas about if you splash some instant hand sanitizer in your hands as you're walking out of a patient's room, is that more effective than hand washing or less effective, assuming you washed your hands appropriately?
Well, that depends on the species.
Yeah, so hand washing really is more effective than hand sanitizers. Not that hand sanitizers aren't a good thing, but I think we sometimes find ourselves a little bit dependent on those, and we kind of get a little quick splash and we think we're all set. So hand washing definitely more effective. However, again, hand washing, even if you do it, you have to do it correctly. So some of the rules that you may have learned are singing happy birthday to yourself or reciting the alphabet to yourself twice. And so that really will be a way to know that you've washed your hands for a long enough period. So just kind of running your hands under the faucet for a brief second is not appropriate hand washing. And then kind of related to your comment, so there are increasingly what are called bare below the elbows policies. And actually this past year, one of the national organizations basically recommended that we should all adopt these bare below the elbows policies. And so the idea is that if you're a physician, you're examining an infected patient, you're wearing a nice tie, you're leaning over the patient, your tie, you don't realize it kind of falls into their wound. Then you go talk to the next patient and you're transmitting your bacteria from patient to patient. And there have been outbreaks of infection, and there have been studies too where physicians will basically have their ties cultured and they'll be growing all sorts of stuff, basically. So bare below the elbows policies basically are things like not wearing ties or wearing bow ties or tucking your tie into your shirt when you're examining a patient, not wearing wristwatches, not wearing jewelry, although usually there's an exception for wedding rings. Also not wearing long nails, and in fact when I was in Oregon, the hospital that we were working at banned the use of artificial and long nails because you can have bacteria that can live in those nails, for instance. And so those are just examples of some of the ways that we can have a little bit more infection control.
That's what I was going to say, was our hospital has a policy against fake nails and nail polish.
Yeah, the nail polish one was somewhat new to me recently, and I didn't at first understand why that is, but I guess, well, do you know why it is? Why the nail polish itself is an issue? Because when I first heard that, I thought, well, what does the nail polish do as far as...
Doesn't it get around the outside and like build up in the cracks and stuff?
Yeah, so it can kind of build up and then it can chip off and
Yeah.
you can have spread that way too. So yeah, that's another example of banning nail polish. And then, of course, shopping cart handles infected with all sorts of stuff, more than one.
Awesome.
There are periodically you'll see actually reports on what are the most infected or not infected but contaminated things. Some of the things that you'll see are, of course, your phones have all kinds of stuff growing on them. Bottoms or the interior bottoms of purses are often talked about as being a thing where there's all kinds of bacteria growing. That said, I mean, I do antibiotic research for a living, and I am playing around with all kinds of bacteria, and I'm far from a germaphobe. And I mean, I think in the end, even though we talk about all of these different places where bacteria live, for the most part, we're fairly free from being infected. So I think don't let all of what I'm talking about alarm you too much, I would say. Another thing that promotes resistance would be nosocomial transmission, and so this is a picture from Haiti after the earthquake, so just showing there are all these patients who are in rather close proximity to each other who can very easily transfer infection and also resistance back and forth to each other. This is obviously a severe example in Haiti during the course of an emergency, but even in Maine Medical Center, which you would think would have all of the state-of-the-art ways to prevent transmission back and forth to patients, Maine Medical Center has had some pretty bad data as far as showing the incidence of nosocomial infections, for instance, and spread from patient to patient. So even in a modern healthcare system, it's very easy to have nosocomial transmission. Related, I guess idea would be the idea of what are close contacts. And so I like to use this slide because this is the only example that I know of a published study using an illustration of a football lineup. And this is actually in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is pretty much the preeminent medical journal that we have. And so this is a report of an outbreak of MRSA skin infections in NFL football team. And so the reason for the picture of the lineup is to show which players were disproportionately affected by this outbreak during this outbreak. And so what they found was that your linemen who were constantly grappling with each other were more likely to have MRSA compared to, say, your quarterback who's relatively free from physical contact. And so definitely with MRSA, as you'll learn, close contact is a big factor for infection. And so there's a lot of cases nowadays of, for instance, high school wrestlers who have MRSA outbreaks and that sort of thing. So close contacts also are at risk for infection and for resistance. Then you have animal sources of resistance. We've talked a little bit about this. This is a picture of my dogs. And so again, dogs can have MRSA. They can have lots of other potential things. There have been outbreaks of MRSA, or rather cases of MRSA infection from pigs, for instance. And so again, don't get rid of your pets, certainly. And don't start avoiding contact with your pets. But there are examples of cases of resistance transmitted from animals, including pets. Then from another animal point of view, I guess, there's the issue of antibiotic use in livestock. And so for those who aren't aware, The Onion is a satirical newspaper, which also, I think it still exists in its print form, but it has a website as well. So this is an article from The Onion, which is all satire. So this is not a true news story. They just make these satirical news stories. But this is showing basically that they're reporting that U.S. children get the majority of their antibiotics from McDonald's meat, basically. So it's not true. But the point of this is that we do use antibiotics in livestock. It's been shown that we have the development of resistant pathogens in animals as a direct result of this. And so, for instance, it's been shown that if you culture chickens in the grocery store, they often will have Campylobacter growing in them, and on top of that, they often will have quinolone-resistant Campylobacter because we use quinolones often in poultry, for instance. And so there's been a lot of regulation over the years, or pushes to avoid the use of antibiotics in livestock. This is another article from The Onion, so also satirical, but so French's has not truly introduced antibacterial mustard, although I honestly would not be surprised if it happens. And so, as you probably are well aware, if you are in a grocery store looking at the soap aisles, for instance, half of them or more say antibacterial soap, basically. And Really, there's no need, in my opinion, for antibacterial soaps. Soap on its own, if you use it correctly, is antibacterial. And so unfortunately, I think as a society, we are increasingly putting antibiotics into more and more commercial products. There are antibacterial containing paints so that you can have a nice disinfected wall in your bathroom, for instance. There are disinfected, or rather, office supplies with disinfectants in them. A few years ago, I had long lost my baseball glove, and I wanted to buy another baseball glove, and the interior where your palm goes had an antibacterial coating to it, and so really it's sort of ridiculous in my opinion how many things have antibacterials in them, and it maybe wouldn't be a problem, but there have been studies showing that the use of things like antibacterial containing soap does promote resistance because you're having sort of constant exposure to different antibacterials, and so in my opinion a big problem that we're doing as a society is putting antibacterials into so many different things. And then vaccination, so I wouldn't say that vaccination leads directly to resistance, but it leads to infection, which can then lead to resistance as well. Have you heard about Andrew Wakefield?
Yes.
So Andrew Wakefield, for those who don't know, was a British physician who published one of the first studies revealing a link between vaccinations and autism. Caused a huge scare, and really he's responsible still for a lot of the anti-vaccination sentiment that's out there. It was later discovered that the study he published, which was in one of the more notable medical journals, The Lancet, was completely fabricated, basically. And so if you go to that Lancet article right now, there's a big red withdrawn or retracted, I think, statement across the entire PDF of that article. He's also been disbarred as a physician as well. And so, and then do you know who is on the top left? Well, I guess you do, because I wrote her name. But so, Jenny McCarthy certainly is I think in many ways, the face of the current anti-vaccination movement. Her child was thought to have autism. I think the latest news is that their child actually does not even have autism. She attributed that autism to vaccination. Unfortunately, I think most people think that she got a little bit too much public attention from people like Oprah and was sort of this, fairly uneducated person who was suddenly this source telling parents not to vaccinate their children. And so, really at this point, there's no evidence whatsoever that vaccines cause autism, and yet there's still quite a bit of stories in the news these days about vaccination denialists and, should we force parents to vaccinate their children? I think just today I saw a story about some parent who was arrested for not vaccinating their children. And so it's a very controversial societal topic, certainly, which I don't want to get too much into, but we definitely do know that when you stop vaccinating, there can be, unfortunately, outbreaks of infection, such as the recent measles outbreaks that we've been having as one example. And then finally, overuse of antibiotics, certainly, and so this is another satirical cartoon, but we definitely use antibiotics quite often for things that really don't require antibiotics, so upper respiratory infections being just one example. So I've said before that I'm sure, not putting any blame on our health facilities here, but if you went to our little health clinic here with some sniffles, I would not be surprised if you were offered a Z-Pack, right? Anyone had that experience? So we definitely overuse antibiotics for many different things. So any questions about any of that? Okay, so now appropriate antimicrobial therapy. So first of all, I think before we talk about what's appropriate use, we have to decide, is there a reason to have appropriate use? Is there a relationship between antimicrobial use and resistance? And there really clearly, or somewhat clearly is. Some studies show an inconclusive relationship, but this is one example of a study that showed a very clear relationship. And so you see on the x-axis, you have total antibiotic use per 1,000 people per day, and then you have on the y-axis, you have the percent of strep pneumo isolates that were penicillin non-susceptible. And as you can see, there's a fairly clear trend between increasing antibiotic use and increasing lack of susceptibility in Streptococcus pneumoniae. So this is one example of a clear distinction or relationship between using drugs more and inducing resistance to those drugs. And so that said, how can we use antibiotics better? And so there's a paper that I like that talks about different fallacies in antimicrobial use. And this paper is in last week's folder of readings. And so This is a fairly old paper, as you see, from the 80s, but it talks about all of these different fallacies in antimicrobial use. And so we'll go through all of these different fallacies in how we use antibiotics. So the first would be broader is better. So certainly a fallacy. So as I've said a few times, if you're in that empiric phase of therapy, you don't know what someone is infected with, what do you do, and how do you approach designing a good empiric regimen? So you could give someone 2 antibacterials, you could give someone antifungals, you can give someone antivirals, but do you really need to cover every single possible pathogen? So really for most infections, so a UTI, if someone based on you're taking your history, you're doing your physical exam, you think someone has a UTI, the chance that that is a pseudomonal UTI is very small. The chance that it's a fungal UTI is very small. So you really have to, kind of based on the site of infection, design a rational regimen that doesn't cover actually every single thing that might be infecting someone. And also everything, or all empiric therapies will have at least some gaps, and so it's important to resist the urge to cover everything that you possibly would like to cover. That said, so the next 2 slides are some examples of the clinical outcomes as far as broader coverage. And so this is an example of the fact that sometimes broader coverage is better up to a point. And so this is looking at patients who were in an ICU, they had pneumonia, and looking at basically the outcomes of patients who had what was defined as inadequate therapy. So that was therapy that either had a hole in its coverage, so you weren't covering, for instance, MRSA maybe, you gave no MRSA agents, or you used a regimen to which the organism was resistant. So again, this is that empiric phase of therapy, so you don't know your MIC, so you're kind of guessing. And so inadequate therapy was defined as you guessed wrong and you chose something to which the organism was resistant. Then comparing that to adequate therapy, and so as you can see, as far as mortality rates, in the black bars you have inadequate therapy, and in the white bars you have adequate therapy, where you provided coverage of what was infecting the person. So what this shows really is that if you don't cover an organism, then clearly your mortality is higher. And so in these patients, if you fail to give appropriate antibiotics, you've caused increased mortality. So you're kind of balancing this type of data, again, with the idea of covering every single possible thing you can, which is sometimes a difficult thing to balance. This is an example of broader not being better. And so when it comes to Pseudomonas aeruginosa and the other space bugs, for many years the dogma was that you had to basically give 2 drugs to treat Pseudomonas. And that was what we always did, basically. However, what this shows is, so you have hospital stay in days on the x-axis, and you have cumulative survival. So what this shows basically is that it's a little bit hard to see, but here you have inadequate therapy where you failed to cover Pseudomonas. And then next to the blue text there, you actually have 2 lines that are pretty much superimposed on each other. Those are both adequate therapy where you provided activity against Pseudomonas. One of those lines, however, is adequate combination therapy with 2 antibiotics. The other line is adequate therapy where you chose 1 antibiotic that happened to cover Pseudomonas. So they basically are on top of each other. And so the point of that is that if you covered Pseudomonas with 1 drug, adding a second drug didn't give you any better outcomes. And so now this dogma of using 2 drugs for Pseudomonas has really gone out the window, and we just use 1 drug, and that alone will be enough to give us a good outcome. If that makes sense. So the next fallacy would be failure to respond is failure to cover. So there are a few infections where someone, on day 2 of therapy is going to be suddenly doing jumping jacks and feeling perfectly fine. So it takes a while for infections to resolve and for patients to do better. An example here would be that patients who have staphylococcal endocarditis will be showing fevers for up to 2 weeks, for instance. So really the point of this is being sure that you don't, you started a patient on a regimen and then the next day they're still febrile, so you think, oh, I must have done the wrong thing and I have to change my regimen. So really, more likely a lack of response, if there is a lack of response, would be not because you gave the wrong antibiotics, but because maybe you missed something. And so one of the phrases that you'll hear is the best antibiotic is surgical steel, basically. And so for instance, with a skin infection, if there's an abscess and you don't drain that abscess, it doesn't matter what antibiotics you give because you won't have successful treatment. And so the surgical intervention point of view is point to this is important. And so again, the major point of this is resisting the change to 2 days into a course of therapy think because the person is not afebrile, you chose the wrong drugs and you have to suddenly switch. Similarly, related would be when in doubt, change drugs or add another. So a classic example would be patient comes in to the ICU, they're admitted directly to the ICU, they have pneumonia, you don't know what they have, the person has risk factors for resistant pathogens, and so you start 2 drugs for Pseudomonas and other gram-negatives, and then you also add MRSA coverage with vancomycin. So a fairly common regimen that you would see would be something like piptazo plus aminoglycoside plus vancomycin to treat all those different pathogens. Then 2 days later, your culture results come back. The person does have Pseudomonas. They don't have MRSA growing. You've not seen any gram-positive cocci on any blood cultures. So do you need to continue the vancomycin? You don't have any evidence to say that you do need to continue it, right? But unfortunately, people think, well, maybe MRSA is there and I just haven't found it, so they'll continue the vancomycin. So it again becomes sort of a balance between covering everything and trusting your culture results. And so again, similar to the last fallacy would be, again, the idea of not reconsidering your therapy early on in your course of antibiotics. Also, fallacy would be sickness requires immediate therapy. So there are many reasons someone could be febrile. Infection is just one of them, and so really there's very few infections where we have to suddenly jump into giving antibiotics on an emergent basis. And so there are many diseases that can cause patients to be febrile that aren't infectious. Some infectious diseases can be managed even without giving antibiotics and just using supportive care. Often delaying antibiotics allows you to get more data, so to get more culture results or diagnostic tests so that you can choose your antibiotics correctly. And so as I said, there are some examples, meningitis being one of the more notable ones, where if you delay antibiotics, you have a big outcomes or a big change in outcomes as far as survival. But there are relatively few examples of that sort of thing where giving antibiotics is so emergent that you can't wait to take some good cultures or do some serological testing, etc. Response implies diagnosis, and so you have a febrile patient, we don't really know what's going on with the person, we have no identified source of infection, you give antibiotics and the person's fevers go away, so hence you magically cured the patient. So fevers can go away for other reasons as well. There's the phrase association is not causation, and so this really comes into play from a clinical point of view where, so that person who had pneumonia or maybe had some respiratory symptoms, had some fevers, we bring that person to the ICU, we start piptazo, we start vancomycin. There are never any positive culture results, so what do you do in that situation? And so I think often there's the reluctance to discontinue antibiotics, but yet you don't know what you're treating, so why are you keeping someone on antibiotics? And so a related thing would also be streamlining as well. So again, with that scenario where you have someone where they're on 3 drugs and you decide that you really are no longer concerned about MRSA, you can go ahead and get rid of the vancomycin because it's not really required, it's only breeding resistance. Next would be bigger disease, bigger drugs. So the question is, what is an appropriate antibiotic to give someone? And simply put, it's an organism that will reliably kill the organism being treated in whatever infection that person has. And that's really all there is to it when it comes to what is a good drug to give someone. So, for example, penicillin, penicillin G, penicillin B, one of the older antibiotics that we have, there are still infections where that's a perfectly reasonable outcome or option to use. And so reasons that you'll sometimes hear providers say about the reason they want to use a particular drug would be, for instance, this drug always works for me, or this is a big gun. So a big gun is a very common phrase you'll hear, which really doesn't mean much of anything. This one is powerful, this one is strong, this one is potent, I like this drug. All not really rational reasons to use antibiotics, but you'll hear providers kind of get used to what works for them and what does not work for them, and they kind of develop habits as far as prescribing things. And so these would all be examples of reasons not to use drugs. Related to that would be bigger diseases, newer drugs. So as I mentioned, penicillin is still the drug of choice for strep throat. So there are often advantages to using older drugs that have narrower spectrum of activity and be less costly as well. Newer agents like linezolid are extremely expensive. Often we might not have the amount of clinical trial evidence as well to support the idea of newer drugs. So really, the point is that using old drugs is often a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And then the cartoon at the bottom there talks about the influence of pharmaceutical reps on using drugs. I do have to say that in the ID world, we're relatively free from the influence of reps because the big companies don't really do anything when it comes to clinical studies and that sort of thing. So compared to someone who maybe is a physician who does cholesterol prescribing, there's a lot less of the constant pressure of drug reps coming to get you to prescribe their different antibiotics because we don't really have the antibiotics. And then antibiotics are non-toxic. So you'll hear the phrase, oh, we'll just add something else on because there's no harm in doing so. But obviously there are many, many examples of side effects that antibiotics can give you, and so just one of them being the bottom one there, C. diff, which is more and more a giant problem and directly attributable to receiving antibiotics. Also drug interactions as well. So certainly antibiotics are not innocuous. And then finally, again, showing, so at that first slide of this particular section showed the relationship between increasing antibiotic use and increasing resistance. This is sort of the opposite outcome. And so this is a very famous study that was published out of Finland. And so Finland basically was noticing that they were having more and more macrolide resistance in community-acquired infections, especially caused by Streptococcus pneumoniae. And so as a nation, basically, they had this active program to discourage the use of macrolides, especially erythromycin. And so as you see there, in 1991 and 1992, there was a nationwide reduction across the board in the prescribing of macrolides. Now, it's one thing to point out is that Finland, a small country compared to ours, they have a national formulary, so it was a little bit easier for them to make this sort of across-the-board nationwide intervention, but they did so. And then here you see what happened as a result. And so there was a little bit of a blip between 92 and 93, so the effect wasn't yet seen. But then if you look from 93, 94, 95, 96, there was a reduction in the incidence of macrolide resistance in strep, including group A strep and other strep isolates as well. So this is a very famous kind of hallmark study showing the result of reducing the amount of use of a drug and then having a corresponding decline in resistance. So related to that would be then the idea of de-escalation or streamlining. So again, if you have a patient who's on multiple drugs, including coverage for MRSA, you have no evidence that the person has a risk for MRSA, then you de-escalate or you streamline your regimen. So you get rid of the anti-MRSA coverage, basically. Also, appropriate durations of therapy. Some hospitals will have automatic stop orders so that patients don't accidentally end up on weeks and weeks of antibiotics because someone forgot to DC their antibiotics. Again, I've talked about this a lot, I know, but empiric therapy, again, there's that balance between an empiric therapy regimen which covers as many things as possible and then making sure that you narrow your spectrum of coverage afterwards. And so you don't have to continue with the antibiotic regimen that you start on day one. You can change it and de-escalate, etc. So this helps to reduce the amount of exposure to antibiotics, helps to reduce costs, and ultimately helps to reduce resistance rates as well. So, any questions so far? So we'll go through the last little bit of antimicrobial pharmacodynamics, and then we'll be done. So this shows your three pharmacodynamic, or PK/PD parameters, and so these are the three parameters that are of interest when we are trying to evaluate how an antibiotic works, essentially. And so these are all related to the MIC as a part of that PK/PD index. And so this just shows you a typical concentration time curve after receiving an antibiotic. So you have time on the x-axis, concentration on the y-axis, then you have your MIC plotted as a concentration. And so the three PK/PD parameters would be the ratio of your Cmax or peak level to your MIC, the ratio of your AUC to MIC, and usually the AUC that we use is the AUC from 0 to 24 hours. And then there's the amount of time that your concentrations of your drug are above that MIC. So is that clear? So let's say we have a new drug and we don't really know the ways in which it works. We don't know the PK/PD parameters that affect it, and so we want to try to figure that out. So how do we do that? So the first thing we do is we want to determine which one of those three PD parameters on the previous slide matters for this drug and helps to predict its efficacy. Once we know that, we want to determine what value of that parameter do you need to find or obtain. So what what value of Cmax to MIC do you need to obtain to get good outcomes, basically. Then you can perhaps use those two pieces of information to decide how to dose your drugs and how to use your drugs to get better action of your drugs. And so the way we do this basically and how we figure out the answers to those two top questions would be what's called dose fractionation. So this is an example of a dose fractionation study. These are cartoon mice because these studies are often done in mice. And so a typical study would be the so-called mouse thigh neutropenic model. And so when you do these studies, you make your mice neutropenic, then you inject their thighs with bacteria, you give them therapy or not, wait a few days, and then you chop off the thigh basically from the mouse, you grind it up, and you count the number of bacteria that are in that mouse thigh. So that's one of the more famous ways that we do, or not, I don't do them, but people do those types of studies. And so dose fractionation basically comes into play because if we're looking at, for instance, ciprofloxacin, and we want to figure out the PK/PD parameter that matters for Cipro. And so I'm going to divide the room in two. And so those of you on the left, I'm going to give you 500 milligrams, just a single dose of ciprofloxacin. And I've already infected all of you with E. coli. You didn't know I did that. But you walked through the door, and there was a big gun shooting E. coli into your lungs. And so you all have E. coli pneumonia. And I'm going to give all of you a single 500 milligram dose of Cipro. And everyone on the right, you'll get 2 grams of Cipro. Again, a single dose. And everyone over here dies, everyone over there lives. So can I use that data to figure out the PK/PD parameter that made you live and you not live? You can't, right? Because the peak would change, the AUC would change, you'd have a higher AUC over here compared to over here. And then the time of the MIC would also change because essentially you're starting off at a higher peak, and so given the same half-life, you're going to take a longer time to get down to that MIC. So all 3 of those things would change, and so I can't figure out what was the parameter that led to that outcome. And so what you do with dose fractionation is you give lots of different doses at lots of different intervals, and that allows you to kind of tease out which one of those 3 PK/PD parameters was what mattered, essentially. Because you're getting lots of different AUCs, lots of different Cmaxes, lots of different time of the MICs as well. So here is an example. This is answering that first part of the equation. So what is the PK/PD parameter that matters? And so this is one of those mouse thigh models. So on the y-axis here you have, on a logarithmic scale, the number of colony-forming units, or CFU, or basically bacterial colonies per thigh of the mouse after 24 hours of therapy. And so what you see there is a plotting of these 3 PK/PD parameters. So on the left there you have increasing AUC to MIC values. On the middle there you have increasing peak to MIC values, and on the right you have increasing time of the MIC values. And so what you're looking for is that on the left, for instance, there's really not a clear relationship between AUC to MIC and the number of colonies in your mouse thighs, right? And so you have some you have some good outcomes with your higher AUC to MICs, but you also have some mice that have very high bacterial counts. Also, the peak to MIC is basically just a scatter plot. There's really no direct relationship, whereas if you see the time of the MIC, there's a much tighter curve between, if you increase time of the MIC, then you have lower counts in your mouse thighs, rather, and so you have a better outcome from a killing point of view. And so the conclusion only at this point of the study would be that for this antibiotic, time of the MIC is what correlates with bacterial killing and correlates with efficacy. So this particular example would be in the cephalosporin. Remember that beta-lactams are time-dependent killers, and so that would make sense for this type of antibiotic. On the right, or on this slide rather, you have kind of the opposite scenario, and so you have, again, with time of the MIC, just a scatter plot essentially, and so no clear relationship. You have a little bit of a tighter relationship between peak to MIC, but then the best fitting curve is with your AUC to MIC. And when you truly do these studies, you would actually do the statistics and you would report R-squared values or correlation coefficients, and so you would see that the best correlation was between AUC to MIC and your outcome. And so in this example with a quinolone, AUC to MIC is what matters for fluoroquinolones, and so that becomes the outcome that we wanted to maximize. Make sense? So next we want to determine what is the magnitude of that PD parameter that we want to obtain. And so here you have, again with a quinolone, so we know AUC to MIC matters, and so you have on the x-axis there you have increasing AUC to MIC values, then you have mortality as far as percent of mice that died or lived. So essentially you want to decide what is, so you're trying to figure out what kind of AUC to MIC do I need to obtain to achieve the outcome that I want. And so you can really decide what that outcome is. And so if you wanted to decide on the AUC to MIC that would provide for 50% mortality, you can do that. I would say that's on a very realistic mortality rate to really try to aim for. So if we wanted to aim instead for 0% mortality, what would be the AUC to MIC that we would need to obtain? And so this is showing that relationship, and so you can see on the left that you reach that point of 0% mortality when your AUC to MIC reaches, in the case of on the left, a gram-negative 100, and on the right, a gram-positive 25. So basically at this point with this new drug, if we're just testing a new drug, we know now that in this example, AUC to MIC is what matters, and we also know that if we want to get a good clinical outcome, we need to achieve an AUC to MIC of either 100 or 25, depending on the organism. Then we can then decide on dosing methods that will help us to achieve this goal. So, so this is the principle sort of how you do this makes sense as far as what we're doing with those studies. Okay, so then once we know that, again, we can start devising different dosing strategies to take advantage of those PKPD parameters. And so really, of all the antibiotics that we have, there are relatively few where, clinically speaking, we actually take advantage of these PKPD parameters and use them to decide on dosing. And so we'll go through just a few examples of what we do clinically. So the first would be beta-lactams. And so beta-lactams are time-dependent killers. Time of the MIC is what matters for them. And so you want to have as much time during a day, for instance, where you have antibiotics basically that are above the MIC. So what happens then is we look at more frequent dosing, basically. And so this shows basically the relationship between every 6-hour dosing of piperacillin tazobactam and every 4-hour dosing of piperacillin tazobactam. And so piperacillin tazobactam used to be standardly dosed every 6 hours. We now dose this drug more frequently every 4 hours with a smaller dose. So the total daily dose becomes the same. So you're not running the risk of toxicity, but you're giving smaller doses more frequently, so you're kind of bouncing up and down above your MIC, and you're having a prolonged time with the MIC. And so with beta-lactams nowadays, typically we dose more frequently so that you're not falling below the MIC. So another, and really taking this to the nth degree, I guess, would be doing a continuous infusion. So if you constantly had infusions of beta-lactams throughout the entire day, you essentially have a time of the MIC in 100% of the day, basically. So we do sometimes do continuous infusions. Unfortunately, there aren't many drugs that are stable enough to do that, and so more likely we do this sort of intermittent, more frequent dosing. Next example would be aminoglycosides, and so aminoglycosides depend on the Cmax to MIC ratio. So we want as high a Cmax to MIC ratio as we can get, basically, and we know that the sort of the goal that we want to attain is a Cmax to MIC of 10, is what we want to achieve clinically speaking. And so if you look at the top part of this graph, it shows in the green so-called once daily or extended interval dosing, and then in the red you have multiple daily dosing. And so with aminoglycosides now, rather than give smaller doses every 8 hours, for instance, which used to be the standard, we give a much larger dose and only once per day or maybe once every 2 days depending on renal function. And so as you see there, the consequence of that is that you get a much higher peak with that once daily dosing. So you're getting an adequate peak. And if you use the traditional multiple daily dosing, you fall well below that Cmax to MIC ratio of 8 to 10 that you need. Coincidentally, so it really impacts efficacy by giving you the Cmax to MIC that you want to attain, that we know corresponds with efficacy. Coincidentally, this mechanism or method of dosing also has the advantages of having lower nephrotoxicity and lower ototoxicity. And the reasons for that are that, as you might remember from pharmacology, the tissues in the kidneys and in the ears, it's a saturable process for getting aminoglycosides in there. And so if you basically give your kidneys and your ears a longer time where they're not being exposed to the aminoglycoside, you have less damage to your kidneys and your ears. And so So this method of dosing now is used for most infections, not all infections, and so again, it gives you the advantages of getting that appropriate CNATs to MIC ratio, so you have better efficacy, and also coincidentally gives you lower rates of both nephro and ototoxicity. So then finally, vancomycin. So really, these are the three drugs pretty much that, clinically speaking, we apply these PK/PD principles. And so with vancomycin, we've had over the last number of years a so-called MIC creep in Staph aureus, and so Staph aureus and MICs have been gradually going up and up and up to vancomycin. As a result, we've had, unfortunately, more and more treatment failures of vancomycin. And so in 2009, there basically were revised dosing guidelines for vancomycin. And so vancomycin is an AUC to MIC driven drug. We know that the AUC to MIC that you want to be above is 400. And so now the current methods of dosing vancomycin look for more aggressive dosing. We tend to measure trough concentrations when we're deciding on vancomycin dosing. And so current vancomycin dosing is designed to achieve a trough of 15 to 20 for most infections, which corresponds to an AUC to MIC of 400. So this would be an example of where we were able to safely give higher doses of a drug to achieve the PK/PD parameter that we were interested in. So any questions on that, or really anything from today? Okay. See you in 20 minutes or so.
Yep.